It camouflages fat, that and timidity, also subway grime, fear, and the pastel optimism you wore in high school. It covers for the thick books you've yet to read, the opaque philosophies you only grasp in bits. It's an answer to the push pull question, set yourself apart or blend. It belies the open sky you miss, birdsong, your mom's roast in thick brown gravy while you nibble virtuous brown rice meals. It's for the guys clad like you, dark side out, who touch then leave your heart exposed. It signifies insomnia, matches your coffee, says this place that's braced for loss is now your home. All in black on the streets of New York. A poem by Ona Gritz, who's our guest tonight, from her book of poems, Geode. So, good evening. My name is Charles Carr, and welcome to Philly Loves Poetry, a collaborative program between the Moonstone Art Center of Philadelphia and Philly Cam. The focus of our program, as always, is to give our viewers and our listeners the experience of the rich culture of poetry in the city of Philadelphia. So, tonight we're in our final of our fifth year series, and we really have a very fine poet and writer, Ona Gritz, as our special guest poet tonight. Ona is an award-winning poet, essayist, children's author, and creative writing instructor. Ona's work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Reader, Plowshares, Brevity, and River Teeth. It has been widely anthologized. Recent honors of Ona include two notable mentions in Best American Essays, A Best Life Story in Salon, and a winning entry in the Poetry Archive, now WordView 2020 project. And also, I just wanted to give you a list of some of Ona's work. In 2005 was Ona's first book of poems, Left Standing. In 2014, Geo was published. In 2017, Border Songs was published, and that is a collaboration with our remarkable husband poet, Dan Simpson. Present and Imperfect, which is an essay, was published in 2020. Witness to Resistance, which is an anthology, was published in 2021. And in this coming February of next year, Ona's book, children's novel, August or Forever, will be published. So welcome, Ona. It's really great to have you. And we've spent some time getting ready for this program. So I wanted to really start off and go, write out something that really struck me in your collection in Geode. And I have a habit, and hopefully it's a good habit, of finding a poem in a book that kind of unlocks the whole book for me. It kind of creates that conversation between the whole book for me. And that was in a poem of yours that appears relatively early in the first section. This is a poetry book in three parts, but this poem was titled "Her Window," and I really found it very interesting. The experience of this book is, number one, I really saw you as the almost like the omniscient person looking through the window of your own life and looking back and translated it into poetry and in poetry that people can understand. That's not, and I mean, it's very crisp, but it's very, I mean, the sections and the experiences are ingenious, I really think. But the other part of this is the way this poem, Her Window, starts. And I'll read it, quote, "So this is not a film, and she is not a starlight, just a student. flushed from having rushed to catch the train. So after, after I saw that and I grasped it, I said, as a because I read it a second time, I mean the whole book, and I said, well, that's what it is. This is almost like a film. There's a cinematic quality to this book and to each one of these poems. And I said to myself, this actually could be a wonderful, kind of script for a film or for a 3-act play, because it really unfolds like that. So this image of the window and this cinematic quality, at least I as a reader, is that a realistic way to really interpret and look at this work?
It's a wonderful way to look at this work. Thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be having this conversation with you, Charles. And it's a surprising way to me because I don't think of myself as a very visual person. Writing to me is more of an act of listening. It's very auditory. And I feel like something that I struggle with sometimes is finding the arc or the story. So it actually really delights me to find out that in putting this book together, that you see it as cinematic. I did choose to put the poems chronological, not in the order that they were necessarily written, but I did discover that there was a story because my writing tends to be so autobiographical. There was definitely a kind of natural unfolding if I, followed myself from childhood to young womanhood to motherhood, etc. But I'm really happy to hear that it reads that way to you.
The other quality about this, and which it's an overused word among people who discuss poetry, is accessibility. Mm-hmm. And I would say this book is ultra accessible, that anyone could pick it up. And especially those people say, well, I don't get poetry. And I say, right. Well, maybe you don't get poetry. Maybe you don't get some of those poems that appear in the New Yorker, but I'm going to tell you, if you read this book, you will get poetry. This is really, but the part that I really love about your poetry is its simplicity, the use of common language, and the brevity of of each one of these poems. They're almost like I would say they're not sonnets, but they're sonnet-esque. And especially the way you end poems. It's like a wrapping up, but it's not an obvious wrapping up. It always has a conversation, that last 2 lines, with how you began the poem, so that people are very clear of where do we come in this one poem. And even some of the last lines, for example, in Geode, there's one: beauty can be jagged, a broken thing can shine. And it was the last line. That was in that. In Slow Cooker, in his first weeks, this really blew me away. In his first week, crying was the only means he had to speak or call love into a room. I mean, that's just such a marvelous last line. So I really want to discuss your style and, how you go about approach writing poetry like this. And I have to say, I'm really grateful of how it's not, there's so much of poetry today of what I call it's in code. There's no code here. I mean, this is just straightforward, beautiful language and images. And I think that's glorious.
Oh, thank you. Well, what I'll say is that in terms of clarity, that's important to me. I guess I'm not very interested in poems that are interested in their own intelligence or in their own obscurity. The poems I'm drawn to read are poems that are very accessible and that are more following a line of an emotional, it's more of an emotional telling rather than an intellectual one. I want to be moved by what I read. And so because that's what I read, that's what I aspire to write. And in terms of the endings, I would say that when I'm working on a poem and I find that kind of ending, that's when I know I have a poem. When the ending surprises me,
Mhm.
when it takes me to somewhere I didn't expect to go, or expresses something I either didn't know or didn't know that I could express in that way, that's when I know I have
Mhm.
a poem that I'll probably want to share in some way.
Does part of that clarity or search for clarity really come in the fact that you're also an essayist? And well, as you say, there's a children's novel coming out. I mean, how much does that style of writing spill over into to your writing as a poet?
It's so interesting because I always think of it the other way around. Because I'm a poet first,
Okay.
I studied poetry. I identify as a poet first. I feel that it's always my poetry that's spilling over into my prose, um, for good and for good
Okay.
and for ill. um, Good in the sense
Hmm.
that I do have a sense of language and an ear for it that I think I developed through poetry. And not so good in that what I was saying earlier is that I have a hard time sometimes finding and the arc of a story, which of course, especially like in a book for children, that's something you really need to have in order for the kids to want to turn the pages. Um, but in terms of the clarity, I would say that anything I write, regardless of the genre, I'm writing it to clarify it for myself, to understand it for myself. Um, so so it's almost a natural thing that I'm looking to understand something, so I'm going to write it in a way that that I can understand it, and then hopefully, if I do it right, the reader will as well.
And going back, I mean, we've discussed just some pieces of Geo, right?
Mhm.
But as I read this, how did you come to put the collection together? Did you have, let's say, several poems and said, well, I really want to collapse it down? Because it's very interesting how much in these short poems and in a book of this size, how much history of yourself that you really cover,
Mm,
from the time you were a child and, the struggles of what I'll call it, like, like people do of hiding from, this the cerebral palsy and I guess the way you were being viewed, into motherhood and then into divorce and then into a another life. Can you speak to how you kind of pared this down to make it what it is?
well, I wrote it poem by poem. I wasn't thinking about a book at the point in which I wrote most of those poems. I mean, I hope to have a book, but I didn't have a book in mind. I just was writing my poems. And at some point, it was literally that I felt like I had enough poetry that I could possibly look at them together and see what I had in terms of a full length collection. Um, and it changed a few times. Poems left and poems came in. I had poems that didn't quite fit the theme as much as the other books, as much as the other ones did. I had persona poems that I realized just were a different. They had a different tone. I had a few. I had been playing with form a bit, and I chose not to put the few sonnets I had in there, because I was seeing some kind of connection as I was reading what I had, that it was the autobiographical poems and the stories of my life, the stories of growing up with a disability, of becoming a mother, which in my experience actually really brought the disability to the forefront, because parenting in its earliest years is such a physical job. So learning about that, the significant relationships in my life, my marriage to my son's father, which was a 10-year marriage that was difficult in some ways. And so that difficulty found its way into those poems. And then meeting Dan, who is a poet and who also has a disability. So meeting someone who I didn't have to explain myself to, because we had those things in common. So, I guess I could see my life unfold if I arranged the poems in a certain way, and that's how Geode was born.
Well, it really succeeds. I would ask you, since so much is embedded in this book, is the challenge of having cerebral palsy as a child, as a teenager, and as even the ones you have about as a mother, where you're asking for some help. How much or what do you want people to walk away from after reading this book?
In terms of disability,
What would be your hope? Yeah.
um, largely that it's one aspect of my life, that it's not the whole story, which is why I wrote the book the way I did, or put it together the way I did, where poems about disability sort of weave in and out of the story, rather than, it's not on every page. And that was intentional, because that's how I experience it. It's not something I'm thinking about all the time. It's not something that affects every experience. It affects certain experiences. In my
Mhm.
in my youth, it was really about, I was concerned about how I was seen, and whether disability was a detraction in some way to to my beauty, to my value. And then when I became a mother, it became what it actually is, which is, a set of specific limitations that I needed to figure out how to work around, now that I needed to take care of someone other than just me. Um, but I would say, yeah, the takeaway is just, it's disability, or it's sometimes disability, but that's not the lens all the time.
Really, when I was reading along the book, and I thought, well, disability. Well, Charles, okay, you don't have a disability, but you do.
Mm.
You do. I mean, everybody does to a certain extent, and I don't want to trivialize that. But it said to me like that all of us at times are trying to cover up
Absolutely.
something about ourselves, and we're trying to cover up something of ourselves that we don't. We work so hard at it that we forget that it's there, but
Right.
it's still there. It's always
Right.
there. And so, yes, it is a book about this overcome. But I think if someone steps back and says, "Yeah, I can think of, without, going into a long thing that we all have, including yours truly, that are things that we're trying to cover up and things that we have had to somehow work to overcome." And
Right.
this is one of the great things about this book is that it is overcoming.
Mm.
It is overcoming, and really sharing that overcoming. And I don't want to call it victory, overcoming and dealing with it and living with it. That I think is important for anybody to read, not somebody that's just quote unquote disabled. Anyone, if they step
Right.
back and reflect on their own life and what they are.
It was
Is that
writing
fair to
about,
say?
yes, and it was writing about disability that taught me how universal the experience actually is. Before I wrote Geode, I was writing a column for the online journal Literary Mama, and it was specifically about having the disability I have, raising an able-bodied um, son, and also having a new partner who had a very different disability because Dan is blind. And I think he inspired me to explore this area as a place to write, because he wrote beautiful poems about being blind. But when I first wrote the column, I was thinking, oh, it's so very narrow and specific to my life. Who's going to care? you know, and the response that I got,
Hmm.
mostly through emails from readers, was how much they saw themselves in it. And some of those people had disabilities or hidden disabilities, and some of them didn't. But there were other ways, like a mother of twins who had two perfectly good arms, but both were full. So she couldn't move around and accomplish the things that she
Hmm.
needed to accomplish. And that was a real eye opener to me, that if, and I'm always learning this over and over again, that the more you share about yourself, the more you're willing to um, open yourself up and be vulnerable, the more likely people are going to see themselves in what you write, regardless of what seems like, oh, well, that's just me. What we learn all the time is, no, it's not just me. That's one of the great gifts of literature, right? Is that
Hmm.
we get to discover how much of our inner lives and how much of our struggles are actually really, really common.
Are there specific uh, poets that you have really gravitated toward, or that you feel that have had an influence on, your writing,
Yeah. Well,
on
I've
your
been very
poetry?
lucky. I've been very lucky with having wonderful teachers. I got to study with Sharon Olds at NYU, who's a
Oh,
tremendous
wow,
influence on me. I studied with Galway Cannell, and Stephen Dunn, more
you did.
recently, before he died. Yeah. Um, so they are they're
There,
kind of my go-tos. But also poets that I haven't met, but whose poems are always teaching me. Ada Limon comes to mind as someone that I've been reading a lot lately,
mhm.
and when I read her or when I listen to her read, I often get ideas for poems because her poems resonate so much with me.
Yeah. Well, well, with the poets that you mentioned, Sharon Knowles, especially Galway Canal, and Stephen Dunn, I can see a thread very definitely. Galway Canal is really one of my all-time favorite poets. It's just I actually have a book that has a CD in it, and when I used to, ride, I used to put the CD and listen to his poetry. And it used to kind of calm me down in traffic. But that's really really remarkable because he had that kind of I don't know, he does. He's not like edgy. He just feel very comfortable,
Yeah,
with his poems and listening to him. And it's funny, he actually has one poem, and I was thinking of it. It's funny. I was thinking of it when you were talking about a situation with your son. He has a poem where it was like a birthday party, and he did something that he was really regretted, and he actually wrote this poem about that regret. And I said, "Wow," because and I looked at it as a father. I said, "Wow." I have regrets like that as well, but for him to use a poem, to really kind of writing to his son, I guess, say
yeah,
it was such a beautiful, tender poem too,
yeah. I think
and
that was
that's
his.
that's what he was, and I see that in your work. I see that in your work too, very
Mm,
much that quality of his and what I call intimacy in poetry. and which is really beautiful. What I wanted to also discuss, this is the last, and I always ask the people about their discipline, their
Mm.
process. You know, uh, you know, I have to say for myself, my process is really kind of a little bit unstructured. I mean, I'm not like the person that being interviewed and he said, "Well, I spend 3 hours every morning before I have breakfast writing." Well, I'm sorry, I don't do that. Or but some people do, and so I just wanted to kind of understand your discipline and your process of writing.
I would say, well, I'm very lucky right now because I've been able to structure my life in the last few years where writing is my main responsibility. I'm not writing at the crack of dawn. I'm not a morning person. um, it takes me a good amount of
Uh huh.
kind of wandering around and thinking before I actually sit down to get the work done. But it's a lot better than it was when for many years, I just would wait for lightning to strike, and that's what I thought writing was. Um,
Hmm.
I finally learned actually by going away. I haven't done most of the um, big colonies or anything like that. I've never applied for those, but Dan and I did spend some time in a place called Wellspring House in Massachusetts, where we went away for a week to do nothing but write. And every time we came home, we did this, I think, twice or three times. Every time we came home, I was so depressed that I had to go to my day job, even though I loved my day job. I was a librarian, which is
Yeah.
about the best you can do. But it taught me how much I craved having that time to write. Um, so when I do finally sit down, I read. Often I read things that I've read many times because I reach for things that I love. And I just read to fill my head with beautiful language and with good ideas and to have something sort of to reach and aspire to. And I put the book down once my own writing starts to take over and interrupt my reading. Um, and I
Hmm.
revise as I go, which is both good and bad. I mean, it's fun. I love polishing sentences, but it also it makes me slow. It makes me a slow writer. I don't necessarily
Hmm.
recommend it.
Do both of you kind of share your work in what you call the polishing or ideas, or kind of roll out an idea you have about a poem, and he becomes your sounding board about maybe how you can structure it.
He's very much my sounding board. We're very much each other's sounding board, but not that early in the process. um, while a poem is
Hmm.
forming or an idea is forming, I don't usually talk about it. Once I have a draft down that I feel like, okay, I've done as much as I can do with this. I need Dan's eye on it, or ear on it.
Hmm.
Then I'll share it with him. And we also have a critique group with a group of friends that's very helpful.
Now, is that like weekly, monthly, or how's that run? Your critique
it's
group.
it's it's hard with all our busy lives. I think it started out bi-weekly, then it became monthly. Now it's every month to 2 months. We do it when we can, when everybody can.
Uh-huh. That's great. Well, yeah, this has been a great discussion, but as always, the real fruit of this show is the listening to poetry, and especially listening to our guest poetry. So I would really like to transition to begin to listen to some of this wonderful poetry of yours and take it from there.
Okay, but before we do that, I have a favor to ask you, which is if you would read a poem
Okay.
that you shared with me a while back, about your mother's handwriting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's titled In Longhand. Um, just as a preface to this, my mother had unusually exquisite handwriting. And it's odd. After she died, and I would have had to take care of the estate, she was something about keeping all of her canceled checks. And I looked at these checks and I said, everything that she had to write, she really had this exquisite, artful way of signing. So this is called in longhand. Watching my mother write in longhand was like following the toe of a ballerina sliding along the ground until being swept up into the air. Before the point of her pen created the semicircle of the capital C, she created a small eye hook which anchored the sweep of the downward curve, stopping at the arc of the loop for the lowercase a. The T was raised high like the mast of a sailboat, with an exaggerated stroke for the crossbar, then an upward stroke again, opening the pouch of the H. The crossbar appeared to shelter the braiding of the remaining lowercase letters ERIN, Catherine. For the last name, another rond de jambe of the hand for C, with it connected to two R's, tilted with a dramatized upswinging curve for the finale. My mother's C seemed to cushion the guttural sound of C before an A. Before the advent of return address labels, my mother wrote our full address on the back flap of an envelope with a ballooning uppercase P in Pulaski, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. When I looked at the canceled checks that she saved for years, I sensed the freedom and sensuosity in my mother hidden underneath her reserved appearance. Thank you for letting me read that.
No, thank you. It's so beautiful. And I will share with the reader that the reason I know that poem is because Charles sent it to me in response to a poem that I had just had published. And something I love so much about poetry is how it's always in conversation. You know, even one poem is in conversation with a poem it's never met. So this is that poem, Cursive L. Start with the needle's eye, slide down the slim pole, shoelace loop at lower left, then glide to home. I barely remember who I was at PS 104, shy in certain circles, smallest in my class, always dreaming myself elsewhere, which is why so much is lost. But one third grade morning, bent over porous paper with light blue dotted lines, I clutched a number 2 pencil and made a garland of L's like Christmas lights, like a chain of dolls. Not even my own initial O had me writing in the air as I walked back to my house for lunch, conducting a symphony no one could hear. And then while we're in childhood, this is retelling. The sun was nothing more than an orange the day Lisa ran for the ice cream truck. It was small, and even if it held sweetness, even if it seeped vitamin C, it couldn't stop the car from barreling down Mott Avenue, couldn't shine enough to show the driver the 7-year-old girl dashing in front of his Pontiac so that his foot would choose the brake. The trees that saw it happen were no more than rakes upended. They had no leaves to form shadows. They had no song. For a long moment, doorknobs were merely ornamental. Those of us still in our houses stayed in our houses. I, 5 at the time, kept watching cartoons while the sun watched over us and the trees turned into notebooks so the story could change. 18. We never spoke of what my body couldn't do. So when Jen and Kay left to pick apricots from the spindly tree behind the library, I hesitated. But Rich would be there. I showed up in a wraparound skirt, my excuse to stand at the base, pluck from the bottom branch. The fruit was concentrated at the top. While the others climbed, of course it was rich. I watched, squinting up at him as I had all summer. The night before, he'd finally kissed me, his tongue tentatively grazing my own. Catch, he called now, and I lifted my skirt to form a net. No thought to palsy, to exposing my uneven legs. When the first tangy oval dropped into the voil, I had already begun to taste it, how it felt to feel chosen and whole. And I thought after having this wonderful conversation about poetry, it would be a good idea to read this poem, which is a poem dedicated to a poem. This is in a campus library, with thanks to Maxine Cuman for her poem, Making the Jam Without You. There were blackberries on boil in the book I held that afternoon. A woman alone in a fragrant kitchen, and beyond the house horses in tight stalls, though I knew this from a different poem. In this one, a girl my age slept in another time zone, far from the rituals of sweetening, boxes of pectin, mason jars washed and waiting in rows. Rereading now, I live in the skin of the mother, the volume of silence in my child's absence overwhelming the room. But at 19, I was still a daughter, fresh from Queens, where the jam we ate was store-bought on sliced white. Yet, crouched in those quiet stacks, I suddenly felt homesick as I tasted the word brambles on my tongue. I thought I'd throw in a sonnet because very few sonnets get very little play, since you asked. Yes, darling, it hurt. And don't you believe for a minute I could forget that kind of pain. Clutching hard at your father's sleeve, I burned with it. On my side and my spine, I shook with sweat as you went at my bones, cracking me open with hammer blows. I squatted, pushed, and let out awful groans. Years before, I saw Michelangelo's unfinished statues, those torsos of men pulling themselves from rough blocks of stone. Love, in those first few moments that I spent as your mother, while you flailed and shone, beautifully formed and finally free, I tell you, what I felt like was debris. Perched on a park bench, I watch the other mothers. Across the street, a woman holds a pair of squirming twins as she bounds down the library's concrete stairs. While here, in the playground, another pulls a chubby girl from a vice-like swing, a cup from Starbucks warming her other hand. I'm sure at home they stir steaming pots with infants on their hips, pour cereal and soup as kids tug at them and climb. These women fill tubs certain they can trust their arms to safely brace newborns in water. They walk to the door, open the fridge, answer the phone, nursing through it all. Just now, one runs past chasing a toddler. In the grass, another sends a football soaring toward her son. I tell you, if my spastic limbs could manage it while caring for my own flailing creature, I'd stand up and applaud. At 15 months, my son works his way from the far end of the kitchen. New to walking, his halting step, mostly on tiptoe, resemble my own palsied gait. Soon, I know, he'll steady himself, easily outrace me. But just now, his face, flushed with effort, seems backlit. Mama, he chimes, tilting precariously toward me. Crouched against the wall, I brace myself for his weight, and, I admit, savor it. This flicker of time when he's a little less perfect, a little more mine. Weekend fare. The Ferris wheel is small, rickety, shorter than the squat houses beside it. So when it stops with my child at the top, no one panics. Without strain, I call to him, see the thrill of slight fear glowing on his face. A man speaks to a crackling radio in his palm, and with a squeak of slicker and boots, a fireman appears for what must be the best kind of rescue, a stepladder, and he's a hero, lifting the child in his strong arms, placing him down by my side. I take the boy's sticky hand, walk him through a din of arcade bells, vendors, groups of teens with green fluorescent circles on their chests. We move toward the dark, listening night while he tells and retells the story, the Ferris wheel gaining height, his time in the sky stretching out until it seems he waits there still, his old life growing vague and insignificant below. My 12-year-old returns from camp having learned riflery. He's always liked having something to hold, a spoon raised like a scepter while I pushed his stroller. Later, those matchbox cars and plastic action figures he dubbed pocket toys, though they lived in his sweaty palms. Today, he shows me a paper target, each black-rimmed hole smaller than a fingertip. Most are close to center, which means, of course, he's good at this. When he was a newborn, I watched his wild hands and thought of dandelions bouncing on their stems. Even then, while learning how to hold him, I'd begun to understand a mother's other job, this letting go. Speedometer song. My ex taught our son to angle the rear view, palm the key as he turns it, taught him which pedal makes the Jetta move when he presses his size 12 sneaker against it, which slows and stills it again. He's exacting, our son tells me, critical, yelling, "Slow, I said slow," so that our boy feels his heart leap against the tight sash of his restraint. Now, though, it's just us. One long-legged guy in gym shorts and Red Hot Chili Peppers t-shirt. One mom, jacket tossed in the back seat, who never learned to drive. It's evening, and this stretch of wide suburban road is suddenly ours, not a single car visible for miles. When he revs it, I feel it in my ears first, a kind of suction. Then in my stomach, a slight thrill. I should scold him, I know, insist that he stick to the speed limit. And I will, in a minute. But let me just take in the joy of it first. My boy, who is almost a man now, testing his power, carrying both our lives the way I once did, but with none of my fear. My menstrual cycle speaks. My first lesson for you, with my sometimes sudden splat, sometimes thick, slow syrup, was to be prepared, just like they taught in Girl Scouts. Though I also taught you, you won't always be that good, buttoned-up girl. I showed you that blood doesn't only live on the scale between 911 and a Band-Aid. It's also a mere nuisance, a simple human female fact. As for rage and deep sorrow, occasionally they're just moods. Remember that long ago winter evening on Bleecker? You gazed out a pizza shop window and thought, suddenly desolate, I have no one. When you realized you were due to bleed, the grief lifted as though someone pulled it by a marionette string. That was me. I taught you a new way to read a calendar, put you in cahoots with the moon. Once I said, yes, there is a baby. And many times before and since I told you, no, none. Whether you met this news with relief or heartache was not my purview, though I might have had a hand on the volume controls. These days, I'm in charge of nothing but the thermostat, which I play with like a toddler given free rein in an elevator. You might want to peel off that sweater. Up we go. Um, it's interesting. We were talking about disability and its place in my writing, and I'm always thinking I'm done with it. I always think that I've written every poem and every essay that I have, and then it finds its way back. So this is my most recent, um, with an ending that definitely surprised me and even scared me to the point that I put it away for a while. But then I saw it as its strength. Today I've been declared a dancer, me with my strolling pace and tilting step, but also the kids with hinges and metal hips, the girls on wheels, and all those with missing digits. It's a street fair, and it's ours, we who were born dancing freeform as we figured our way from place to place. No choreographer, no river dance, no one but us moving how we move. Just now the trees with their scribble of uneven branches shake their leaves like fans and boas, none of them the color of envy, none of us trying and failing to imitate you. And here's the requisite pandemic poem. This is Notice Breath for my good friend Julia. Notice breath, my yoga teacher says. It's the year of Corona, and I take her class in New Jersey from my house across state lines. And what I notice today is the lovely unspecificity. Not notice my breath or hers, just breath itself, moving, unhitched, animating each of us. One friend with the virus describes a burning like inhaled chemical fumes. Another, a pressure like a cheetah, chose her rib cage as a place to rest. So yes, these days I notice breath, the way you'd notice a bouquet on your scarred kitchen table. Gathered bursts so bright at first, it's easy to forget they've been clipped from their roots. They're fading, not even all that slow. Mother's Day, I watched as two teenage girls sung a hip-hop love song to a masked and gloved woman on her porch. They stayed on the walk, and I on my side of the street. But when their song ended, the mom or aunt or favorite neighbor crossed the divide, took those girls in her arms, deciding the feel of their heat and heartbeats and sweat was worth daring the beast for once. Every day we're made to weigh it like that, sucking in our breath, letting it out against paper or cloth, noting its warmth as we do. My father blesses me on bulk pickup day. A child of Black Tuesday and bread lines, he loved nothing more than bargains and street finds, 50-cent t-shirts from yard sales, a trashed clock he just might be able to fix. After he died, my own such windfalls became gifts from him. Embroidered red summer dress at Goodwill, lamp with a flowered vase a neighbor had tossed. When my rummaging led to long-held family secrets, I worried about betraying him. I found the word turncoat and tried it on. But then a good desk chair showed up at the curb, and I knew he wanted me to know, to sit with all I'd unearthed and make something that might be of use. A lot of my recent poems deal with mortality, which I guess is maybe the natural result of certain birthdays, but we'll get through them together, and then I'll end, I promise, with a love poem. Dear advice columnist, advise me. People keep dying. My coworker on vacation in Charlotte, aneurysm burst to the brain. My cousin sitting inside a cell phone store. Yes, Inside, that's not a typo. When a car crashed through the plate glass window, mowing right over her small, strong dancer's body as she waited her turn. Before that, my brother-in-law, with the dubious honor of saying goodbye to functions, one after another, goodbye walking, bye-bye holding a spoon, sayonara speech, all in the rapid-fire way ALS decrees. As for my immediate family, cancer, hep C, cancer, victim of a murder. Dear advice columnist, dear me, how do I get the remaining people I love to outlive me without exiting too soon myself? Stop the world, advice giver. Or is it the clock? I want to stay, but only if you stay with me. Not you, per se, figment who can never answer this letter, but you, and you, and you, and you. Surrender. Cindy, our Bronx girl Chihuahua rescue, has a tumor growing in her bladder. Blood told me first, and her vet confirmed it, giving her he couldn't say how long. It's been 10 months, and she's herself mostly, wide-eyed and bossy, though now she wets the linoleum daily, and on our walks she slows, waddling like a very pregnant person, weight of the cranium pressing relentlessly down. When she lost all interest in kibble, I assumed that was it. She was telling us she's done. But 3 days later, I thought to offer chicken from my own plate, and she answered in that full-bodied way dogs say what they say. This is what I live for now. So that's where we are. Past rules made in the days we forgot about death living inside us. If you believe in counting by 7, she's 105. What's left but to surrender to appetite and whim? And since I know how this ends, I love her without worry, though in all my 420 dog years, I never knew one could do such a thing. And I have 2 more poems. Um, Actually, they're both love poems, and they're both for Dan, who's quietly sitting next to me off screen. Office visit. Honeycombing, the doctor says, and for an instant I let myself rest in what I love about that word, sticky, textured, golden noun turned verb. But the world he's leading us through on the nightscape CT scan is inside you, the 2 crucial islands, your lungs. This, he tells us, is healthy tissue, dark sky barely flecked with stars, and this, tapping the line of a lacy shore, scars. I remember the first time I made out our boy's profile on a cloudy screen like this, tiny nub of thumb between what would become his lips. Back then, I saw myself as standing on a precipice, knowing that when I dropped, I would fall toward life. But this, you and I, under the buzzing glare of such harsh life, it's life too, isn't it? I'm asking this of both of us. Notice the heat in our held hands. One of the many reasons I married you. Remember the boat my son built in his mind when he was 8? Sturdy and seaworthy, though not with more than 2 people in it. Every few days he'd climb in, have us join him, and ask me to choose. What he didn't yet know is that I'm the daughter of a woman who gave up her children for a man with no place in the skiff of his heart for kids who weren't his. I will never be her, I told myself over and over. So whenever he asked, it was you I threw into the churning waters he imagined. And you, who, as a boy his age, nearly lost your life in a campside lake, drowned as often as you had to for him to feel safe.
Well, they are absolutely lovely poems, remarkable poems. And what's so great about this Philly Loves Poetry, when I have the poets on, is that, I can hear the voice now,
Mm,
on the page.
yeah.
And you gave a lovely reading of your poems. I,
Oh,
I, ha-
thank
I
you.
had it out and I was reading along with, see all the little things.
Yeah, I heard it. I
And
heard a page or two turning there.
yeah, yeah. So it was really great. And it's really been great having you, Ona. I have to say to our audience, if you really want to give yourself a gift for the
Mm,
holidays, well, there's two books, really. First one, and of course, is Geode, and you can get that wherever you can get it, Amazon. And the other one is Border Songs. They're two really gorgeous books of poems that I enjoyed immensely. And in fact, that I last year I did give friends of mine who are poetry lovers uh, copies of those books. So
yeah.
that's Geode is one, and the other is Border Songs, and that's a collaboration between Ona and her remarkable husband Dan Simpson. So thank you again, Ona, for joining us, and I think it's a great way to end our fifth season of Philly Loves Poetry.
Well, thank you so
And
much for having me.
yeah, it was a great discussion. I wish we had always had more time because there's so much to discuss.
It was fast.
Yeah. So I want to, say thank you, of course, to Ona. I want to thank you to Aaron Phelan, who is our technical director here for Philly Cam, who makes these broadcasts really come alive and does all the necessary switching and everything that has to be done for making a broadcast like this successful. Uh, and in closing the program, as I always do, of course, this is a program that is sponsored by the Moonstone Art Center of Philadelphia. And as I say many times, it's phenomenal what Larry Robin has done over the years to bring the love of poetry to the city of Philadelphia. I mean, consider this, and I've said it before. Moonstone has close to 100 poetry events every year. I mean, this is just one of them. There are other things that occur at Fergie's Live, and there's other virtual shows now. And continuing this year, we've had poets from throughout the United States, and also there's poetry that focuses on some of the major crises, like we had something that had to deal with the crisis in Ukraine. So I only say that to ask you is go to moonstoneartcenter.org and see how you can make a way to support us in our continuing Larry's love of poetry. It's really extraordinary. We are just so blessed in this city to have so many great poets and to have somebody that gives a platform to all those great poets every year and finds a way to do it. He's always searching for a new way to do it. So once again, to our audience, thank you very much for watching and listening in. We'll begin our sixth singers in January. And it should be, as my grandmother said, it should be grand.